Skyward Sword was my most anticipated game of 2011. The series' 25th anniversary drove my excitement for the next mainline Zelda game to a fever pitch, and when it finally landed in November of that year, I was absolutely enamored with it. Over time, Skyward Sword has proven to be one of the most divisive entries in franchise history. Its motion controls, backtracking, and relatively small world caused some to write it off. It makes sense then that in this release nearly 10 years after the original, Nintendo is offering some much needed quality of life improvements. But can Skyward Sword still deliver in a post-Breath of the Wild world? As its name implies, Skyward Sword HD is, well, a new version of Skyward Sword, running in full HD. Seeing Skyloft and the surface world with a fresh coat of paint is a treat for the eyes. The team at Tantalus responsible for developing this new iteration of Skyward Sword did an excellent job transitioning the game's watercolor-like visuals to the Switch. Textures look significantly clearer than they did on the Wii while retaining the feel of the original. Animations are also a one-for-one recreation, which can lead to some moments that remind you that this game is a decade old, but by and large, I was happy to see the world of Skyward Sword through new eyes. Of course, the visuals aren't the only thing that Tantalus has upgraded for Skyward Sword HD. The game runs at a smooth 60 frames per second across the board. I've largely overlooked the frame rate of Zelda games in the past because the mechanics work so incredibly well, but it's going to be difficult for me to go back to the series running at 30 FPS or lower. There are quite a few smaller things as well, like skippable cutscenes and Phi's intrusions being dramatically reduced, both of which are great additions, but the biggest change in Skyward Sword HD has to be the inclusion of button controls. Skyward Sword's controls are easily the most divisive element of the game, with some having adored them while others were unable to stand them. I was in the former camp, so when I began my playthrough, I used Joy-Con in place of the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. Midway through my adventure, I switched to button controls, and I have to say, I actually really like both. Each control method has its pros and cons, but they're both suitable options. For me, combat was far easier on button controls. Using the right analog stick to direct Link's sword attacks felt a bit too easy for my taste, leading some of the game's later encounters to feel frustratingly simple. The ability to use a simplified control method highlighted for me that Skyward Sword's combat was designed with both the idea of fatigue and the inaccuracy of motion controls in mind. Being able to repeatedly flick an analog stick to take advantage of openings meant I was able to land 3 or 4 hits on an enemy where I would normally be able to line up 2 at most with motion controls. On the other hand, Skyward Sword's button controls made it easier to deal with other tasks, especially rolling bombs. I was never able to get a good straight roll with motion controls on the Joy-Con, a problem I didn't experience in the original, but the button controls meant I could use the analog stick to line up Link's rolls, which was a godsend for me. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to play Skyward Sword HD. The inclusion of button controls is great for disabled players that find motion controls difficult, and in different ways each control layout has its own strengths and weaknesses. None of these control options would make much of a difference if they weren't applied to an epic adventure, however. Skyward Sword tells the story of the origin of Link, Zelda, and their unending battle against evil across multiple timelines. The characters in Skyward Sword are incredibly well realized, and in a first for the series, the relationship between Link and Zelda feels meaningful. The motivations that spur Link on to become the hero of legend are relatable and believable. The companions that join them along the way grow as characters throughout the adventure, and as a result, I felt myself becoming attached to them. Yes, that includes Groose too, who as it so happens has one of the best character arcs in the history of the series. Groose begins the game as an absolute heel of a character and one I thought I would hate throughout, but he slowly grew on me as he transformed from an antagonist to one of Link's most trusted allies. It's a turn I didn't see coming in 2011, and one I appreciate even more in hindsight. Skyward Sword is, at least as of this video, chronologically placed as the first game in the Zelda timeline. As such, the game is bursting with lore for longtime Zelda fans like me. If you've ever wondered why Link wears green, where the Master Sword came from, why the Triforce exists, or even why Nintendo insists on Link being a different person in every game, the answers to all of those questions are contained within. Speaking of the Master Sword, we have to talk about Link's companion, Phi. Phi is the spirit that resides in Link's sword and guides him on his quest. They offer tons of valuable information on where to go and what to do, but that isn't what interests me about them. It's the relationship that slowly and subtly builds over the course of the game. It's yet another masterful instance of character development in a game full of it. The dynamic between Link and Phi was among my favorite, taking a backseat only to that of Link and Zelda. As I approached the end of the game, the final scenes between Link and Phi had me nearly in tears. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to that first version of Link, to say nothing of Phi as well as the rest of the supporting cast. Link's adventure sees him in an unfamiliar version of the world we've explored over the last 35 years, one that begins in a small town in the sky. Skyloft is a small village that rests on an island in the clouds. Link is a student at the Night Academy, where kids train from a young age to ride loftwings, giant birds that are the primary mode of transportation for the people above the clouds. Skyloft is a small village that serves as something of a hub world. There are small islands to explore above the clouds, but only a handful of them are important to the main story. Only a handful of people live in Skyloft, and none dare descend beneath the clouds as they're told there's nothing beneath. So of course, that means that's where our adventure begins. After Zelda appears to fall beneath the cloud cover, Link sets out on his adventure to find her, traveling to the surface world below. This is another point that proves to be divisive among fans. The surface is divided into 3 areas: Faron Woods, Eldin Volcano, and Lanayru Desert. Most of the game takes place across these 3 areas, though they change with each new visit. Having to revisit the same places was a common complaint among fans 10 years ago, and one that I disagreed with back then and continue to disagree with now. While it's clear that this design was due in no small part to the technological limitations of the Wii, finding new things to explore each time I went back was a delight. The 3 core areas in Skyward Sword contain some of my favorite dungeon designs in any Zelda game. I can't think of a dungeon mechanic I love more in the history of the series than the time shift stones in Lanayru Desert. Seeing an arid desert transform into an area full of lush greenery and surprisingly advanced ancient technology is an absolute treat. In fact, that ancient technology theme is more interesting to explore now than it was 10 years ago. Revisiting Skyward Sword, I can see the beginnings of ideas that would become foundational to Breath of the Wild. Link's ability to run, complete with a Pi Wedge stamina meter, or his ability to run just a couple of steps vertically up a wall or other surface feels eerily familiar in hindsight. Being able to upgrade and improve items and weapons, while not exactly the same as Breath of the Wild's weapon system, does reintroduce the idea of stats affecting the performance of Link's arsenal, and being able to mix potions to create new unique concoctions feels very much like a seedling of the cooking concept in Breath of the Wild. There are still some issues, however, with Skyward Sword HD that Nintendo didn't address this time around. The Imprisoned, for instance, is still an absolute chore to fight against. Phi still intrudes occasionally, and the main quest feels a bit padded out to extend its playtime near the end. I finished Skyward Sword in about 21 hours, and I enjoyed it, but I feel like Nintendo took the traditional version of Zelda we had become accustomed to with Ocarina of Time to its limits with Skyward Sword. As much as I enjoyed returning to the way Zelda used to be, I'm happy that the next game in the series will continue the evolution of the franchise that Breath of the Wild started. To me, it's clear that Nintendo was beginning to rethink the conventions of the Zelda franchise as far back as 10 years ago. Link's adventure above the clouds stands out as a unique entry in the series and one that fans should absolutely not pass up. Skyward Sword tells a better story and features better dungeons than Breath of the Wild. The new controls, quality of life changes, and rock-solid frame rate are reason enough to take another trip to Skyloft, even if you visited it on the Wii. And if you're a new Zelda fan, Skyward Sword HD will change the way you look at the series as a whole. That wraps up my review of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD for the Nintendo Switch. As always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to Good Vibes Gaming for more reviews just like this one. We're fully Patreon funded, so if you could do me a favor and check out patreon.com/gvgaming, that would help out a lot. Make sure to ring that notification bell to be the first to know every time we upload a new video, and I will see you next time.